In Afghanistan, a coalition of the most technologically advanced militaries on Earth fought for 2 decades against forces that could not match them in aircraft, armor, satellites, or logistics. In Iraq, Vietnam, Lebanon, and Gaza, vastly weaker non-state actors faced professional armies designed to win fast, decisively, and visibly. And yet the outcomes followed a disturbing pattern. The weaker side did not collapse. The stronger side did not truly win. Why did forces that knew they were inferior refuse to close the gap? Why did they not try to become stronger in the conventional sense? And why did the strongest militaries in history repeatedly find themselves trapped in wars they could not finish, explain, or justify? Because these conflicts were never about winning battles. They were about weaponizing weakness itself, turning scarcity, fragmentation, and vulnerability into strategic assets. This was not resistance by desperation. It was strategy built on a fragile assumption that the enemy would remain bound by their own rules, their own metrics of success, and their own fear of political failure. And if that assumption held, the war would never truly end. But if it broke, everything would collapse at once. This episode is not about how weaker forces fight. It is about what problem they are trying to solve. A non-state actor facing a modern state military confronts a structural impossibility. They cannot outproduce. They cannot outspend. They cannot outlast in a conventional sense. Trying to catch up only accelerates defeat. So the strategic problem becomes different. How do you survive against an enemy whose strength increases over time? How do you avoid decisive defeat without ever achieving decisive victory? And how do you turn every display of your own weakness into a pressure point inside the enemy's political, legal, and moral system? The answer is not battlefield superiority. It is strategic inversion. Instead of reducing weakness, the strategy organizes around it. Scarcity becomes flexibility. Fragmentation becomes resilience. Lack of control becomes deniability. And time, normally an enemy, becomes the primary weapon. This is why the strategy is fundamentally non-traditional. It does not aim to end war. It aims to redefine what ending even means. And once that redefinition takes hold, the stronger side begins fighting a war whose success criteria no longer align with its own institutions, alliances, or public expectations. Which raises the next question. What kind of strategic environment allows such a reversal to even be possible? To answer that, we need to map the battlefield the way it actually existed, not the way doctrine assumed it did. To understand why weakness could be weaponized, we need to stop thinking in terms of battlefields and start thinking in terms of systems. Because in asymmetric wars, the battlefield is rarely where the war is decided. The actors and their real objectives. On one side stood modern states and coalitions. They entered these conflicts with declared goals: stabilize a region, defeat insurgency, eliminate terror networks, restore order. But beneath those statements sat a more fragile objective: achieve visible, narratable success without open-ended cost. Their militaries were built to win quickly, demonstrate control, minimize friendly casualties, preserve legitimacy at home and abroad. On the other side were non-state forces whose objectives were narrower and more brutal in logic. They did not need to win. They did not need to govern effectively. They did not need international recognition. They needed only 3 things: to survive, to remain relevant, to prevent the enemy from declaring closure. This asymmetry of objectives mattered more than asymmetry of firepower. The structural constraints shaping the battlefield. The strategic environment was defined by constraints, but not equally. For state forces, constraints multiplied outward. Legal frameworks governing use of force. Media scrutiny operating in real time. Coalition politics requiring consensus. Electoral cycles shaping patience. Institutional metrics demanding progress reports. Every action triggered second and third order effects. A successful raid created legal review. A mistake became a headline. A delay became political ammunition. For non-state actors, constraints worked differently. They lacked resources, yes. But they also lacked responsibility for system maintenance. They did not need to secure supply chains at scale. They did not need to protect infrastructure. They did not need to justify actions to voters or allies. Their operating environment was low overhead and high tolerance for ambiguity. That difference was decisive. Geography without fronts. Doctrine assumed geography mattered in familiar ways. Control territory. Secure lines. Hold ground. But these wars rarely offered clean fronts. Urban density, porous borders, informal settlements, and civilian intermixing collapsed traditional distinctions. The battlefield became neighborhoods instead of sectors, networks instead of formations, influence zones instead of front lines. Holding ground often became a liability. When state forces cleared and held areas, they inherited governance responsibilities, security burdens, expectations they could not meet fast enough. When non-state actors abandoned ground, they lost little. They could dissolve, relocate, and reconstitute elsewhere. Space favored the side that did not need to occupy it. Time is a structural imbalance. Time is usually an ally of the stronger force. Here, it reversed. State actors operated under timelines they did not control. Budget cycles. Deployment rotations. Public patience. Alliance cohesion. Each year without resolution increased pressure to explain why victory had not arrived. Non-state actors faced no such clock. They could lose fighters today and recruit tomorrow. They could disappear for months and return unchanged. They could wait out commanders, governments, even strategies. Time was not neutral. It punished the side that needed progress and rewarded the side that only needed persistence. Information as contested terrain. Information did not simply report the war. It shaped it. State forces communicated through formal channels. Press briefings. Official reports. Carefully worded statements. These channels demanded coherence and consistency. Non-state actors exploited asymmetry here as well. They operated in fragments. Videos without context. Claims without verification. Narratives built on emotion rather than fact. They did not need credibility in the traditional sense. They needed attention and ambiguity. Every unclear incident forced the stronger side to respond. Every response carried risk. Silence looked like guilt. Action looked like escalation. Information warfare was not about persuasion. It was about forcing reactions under uncertainty. The enemy's blind spots. The stronger side entered these conflicts with assumptions that quietly shaped every decision. That victory would be recognizable. That control could be measured. That deterrence would function. That rational actors would avoid prolonged pain. These assumptions were rarely stated. They were embedded in doctrine, metrics, and command culture. Non-state actors did not need to outthink doctrine. They only needed to refuse its premises. By avoiding decisive battles, they denied metrics. By absorbing punishment without collapse, they denied deterrence. By continuing after losses, they denied closure. What looked irrational at the tactical level was coherent at the strategic level. The map no doctrine taught. If we redraw the strategic map honestly, it looks different. The decisive terrain is not hills or cities. It is political legitimacy, institutional patience, narrative coherence, cost tolerance. In this map, weakness is not a deficit. It is camouflage. It lowers expectations. It shifts blame. It reframes endurance as success. And once this map is accepted, a disturbing realization follows. The standard playbook, concentration of force, decisive engagement, visible dominance, does not fail because it is poorly executed. It fails because it is fighting on the wrong map. Which leads to the next problem. If doctrine points in the wrong direction, what exactly does it tell commanders to do, and why does following it make things worse? Military doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It standardizes responses. It turns chaos into procedure. Against peer adversaries, this is strength. Against non-state actors weaponizing weakness, it becomes a liability. What normal commanders are trained to do? Most modern doctrines converge on a familiar logic. If the enemy is weaker, apply pressure. Deny sanctuary. Disrupt command and control. Attrit forces until collapse. Transition to stabilization. This logic assumes three things. First, that the enemy has a center of gravity that can be degraded. Second, that pressure produces predictable responses. Third, that success will eventually become visible and irreversible. On paper, this makes sense. In these wars, it does not. Why conventional escalation leads to stalemate? When doctrine tells a commander to escalate, it expects the enemy to react by defending key terrain, concentrating forces, making mistakes under pressure. But a force that embraces weakness reacts differently. It disperses instead of concentrating. It abandons terrain instead of defending it. It absorbs losses instead of collapsing. Each doctrinal success produces a strategic paradox. Clear an area, and you inherit it. Destroy a cell, and you validate the narrative of resistance. Increase patrols, and you increase exposure. Reduce risk to civilians, and you reduce freedom of action. The stronger force keeps winning tactically and losing strategically. The trap of measurable progress. Doctrine demands metrics. How many fighters neutralized? How many districts secured? How many incidents reduced? These metrics are designed for wars where degradation equals victory. But against non-state actors, metrics distort reality. A decrease in attacks may signal deterrence. Or it may signal adaptation. An increase in attacks may signal enemy strength. Or it may signal desperation. Doctrine treats numbers as evidence. Strategy requires interpreting why numbers move at all. When weakness is the enemy's shield, raw metrics lie. The false promise of decisive engagement. Doctrine assumes that somewhere, sometime, the enemy must commit. That if pressure is sustained, a decisive moment will arrive. This assumption is rarely questioned, and rarely holds. Non-state actors do not need decisive engagements to survive. They need to avoid them. Every avoided battle preserves force. Every inconclusive clash reinforces endurance. Every withdrawal frustrates closure. Doctrine waits for a climax that never comes. And waiting becomes strategy by default. Stabilization as a strategic dead end. When decisive victory fails to materialize, doctrine pivots. From combat to stabilization. From enemy-centric to population-centric operations. This shift is supposed to close the conflict. Instead, it often deepens the trap. Stabilization imposes governance burdens, economic expectations, security guarantees. The stronger side becomes responsible for outcomes it cannot fully control. The weaker side exploits this asymmetry. Every failure of governance becomes propaganda. Every unmet expectation becomes recruitment fuel. Every security incident becomes proof of illegitimacy. The war does not end. It mutates. Why doctrine cannot adapt fast enough? This is not because doctrine is unintelligent. It is because doctrine is institutionalized. It is taught, evaluated, promoted, and funded through systems that reward clarity, replicability, predictability. A strategy built on ambiguity, endurance, and political friction does not fit. Commanders who deviate risk career damage, legal exposure, political backlash. So even when individuals sense the trap, institutions continue forward. Not because they believe, but because they lack permission to stop. The unspoken contradiction. At the heart of the failure is a contradiction doctrine does not resolve. The stronger side must be decisive, be restrained, be visible, be patient. All at the same time. Non-state actors exploit this impossibility. They do not need to defeat doctrine. They only need to force it to operate under incompatible constraints. And once doctrine begins generating outcomes it cannot explain, a new question emerges. If following the rules leads to failure, how does a decision to break them even begin? Unorthodox strategies are rarely born from brilliance alone. They emerge from constraint, fear, and the quiet realization that every orthodox option leads to loss. This decision does not begin with confidence. It begins with recognition. The moment doctrine stops making sense. Inside non-state movements, there is often a brief and dangerous phase. Early optimism collapses. Direct confrontation fails. Losses accumulate faster than gains. At this point, many movements die. The ones that survive reach a different conclusion. They accept that victory, as defined by the enemy, is impossible. And instead of asking how to win, they ask a colder question. What does the enemy need in order to stop fighting? This shift matters. Because the answer is rarely military. Internal resistance to embracing weakness. The decision to weaponize weakness is not intuitive, even for the weak. Inside these organizations, the proposal triggers backlash. Fighters want revenge. Commanders want momentum. Political wings want legitimacy. To tell them, we will not seek decisive battles. We will retreat even when we appear strong. We will allow ourselves to look weak. Sounds like surrender disguised as theory. Leaders who propose this face internal risks. Loss of authority. Fragmentation. Defections. Splinter groups pursuing escalation. Choosing weakness as strategy means choosing control over glory. That choice alone eliminates many would-be leaders. The core assumptions behind the decision. When the unorthodox strategy crystallizes, it rests on several fragile assumptions. First, that the enemy's political system is more fragile than their military system. Second, that the enemy cannot sustain prolonged ambiguity, they need narratives, milestones, and closure. Third, that restraint will not be rewarded, but excess will be punished. This is the critical bet. The strategy assumes that every escalation by the stronger side increases their political exposure. Every mistake compounds pressure. Every delay erodes legitimacy. If these assumptions are wrong, the strategy collapses fast. There is no fallback. What the strategy actually targets. This is where many observers misunderstand the move. The target is not troops. It is not territory. It is not even leadership. The target is decision-making under constraint. The strategy is designed to force constant reaction, multiply small incidents into systemic stress, create dilemmas with no clean resolution. Each action is calibrated not for damage, but for response cost. If the enemy responds hard, legitimacy suffers. If they respond softly, deterrence erodes. If they delay, credibility weakens. The goal is not to trap forces. It is to trap choices. The quiet role of patience. This strategy demands something rare in conflict. Patience without illusion. There is no promise of breakthrough. No final offensive. No turning point. Success looks like survival. Continuity. Persistence across leadership changes on the other side. This patience is organizational, not emotional. It must survive arrests, losses, droughts of funding, and long periods of invisibility. Most groups cannot sustain this. Those that do become structurally hard to defeat, even when tactically weak. The moral ambiguity at the core. At this stage, a darker reality appears. By choosing this strategy, leadership accepts that suffering will be prolonged. Civilians will remain exposed to uncertainty. Resolution is delayed by design. This is not ignorance. It is calculation. The belief is that short wars cannot be won, and long wars cannot be borne by the enemy. Whether that belief is justified is a separate question. But it defines the strategy. The decision point. When this unorthodox path is chosen, there is no announcement. No doctrine rewrite. No manifesto. The shift reveals itself only in behavior. Battles avoided. Opportunities declined. Pressure absorbed rather than answered. To outsiders, it looks like weakness. To the leadership, it is a deliberate narrowing of risk. And once this decision is made, the war changes character. Because strategy no longer lives on paper. It has to survive reality. Which raises the most dangerous phase of all. How does a strategy designed around fragility actually function under stress? A strategy built on fragility lives or dies in execution. On paper, weaponized weakness looks elegant. In practice, it survives only if it can endure stress without collapsing into chaos. This phase is where most such strategies fail. translating theory into behavior. Execution does not begin with grand operations. It begins with restraint. Orders are issued not to advance, but to avoid exposure. Cells are instructed to disengage rather than exploit success. Opportunities that look tactically favorable are declined. This is counterintuitive for fighters trained to seek momentum. Leadership must impose discipline that feels unnatural. No massing of forces. No permanent positions. No symbolic victories that invite retaliation. The organization learns to do less on purpose. That discipline is harder than aggression. Operational design, fragmentation by choice. Weakness becomes operational through fragmentation. Not as a symptom of disorganization, but as policy. Units are kept small. Links are loose. Command chains are deliberately shallow. The goal is not efficiency. It is survivability under pressure. If one node is compromised, it cannot expose the whole. If one cell is destroyed, it does not disrupt operations elsewhere. This design accepts inefficiency as the price of resilience. But it carries a cost. Fragmentation limits coordination. It slows learning. It increases variance in behavior. Every action becomes harder to control. Logistics without mass. Traditional logistics sustain armies. Here, logistics must disappear into society. Weapons are simple, durable, and replaceable. Supplies move in small quantities. Caches are temporary. Nothing exists at scale long enough to be targeted. This keeps cost per operation low, and detection risk lower. But it also means no stockpiles for surge operations. No buffer against prolonged disruption. Constant dependence on local tolerance. The strategy survives only while the logistical footprint remains beneath the enemy's detection threshold. Communication under pressure. Communication is the most fragile component. Centralized command invites decapitation. Decentralized command invites drift. To manage this, leadership relies on broad intent rather than detailed orders. Doctrinal guidance over real-time control. Narrative cohesion instead of tactical precision. Operators are given permission to interpret, not instructions to follow. This increases adaptability. It also increases risk. One rogue action can trigger escalation. Undermine legitimacy. Force the enemy into a response cycle the strategy cannot absorb. Control is statistical, not absolute. The risk architecture. Every move is evaluated not by damage inflicted, but by response cost. The central operational question becomes: what will this action force the enemy to do? A low-impact action that provokes an expensive response is ideal. A high-impact action that clarifies the enemy's options is dangerous. This reverses normal operational thinking. Success is measured by overreaction, misallocation, political fallout. Failure is measured by silence, adaptation, strategic restraint by the enemy. The worst outcome is irrelevance. Micro-twist, the temptation to escalate. Here lies a recurring failure point. When pressure builds and patience wears thin, internal voices grow louder. Hit them harder. Make them feel it. Prove we still matter. Escalation promises relief and often delivers short-term visibility. But it also does something irreversible. It simplifies the enemy's decision space. A dramatic attack clarifies intent, justifies force, unifies opposition, collapses ambiguity. What looked like strength becomes exposure. Many movements destroy their own strategic advantage at this moment. Micro-twist, the illusion of success. Another danger is subtler. As the enemy struggles, leadership may misread signals. Delayed withdrawal becomes interpreted as weakness. Public dissent is mistaken for imminent collapse. Internal debates on the other side are seen as proof of victory. This breeds overconfidence. The strategy begins to chase outcomes it was never designed to achieve. Territory is held too long. Forces are concentrated for effect. Visibility is pursued. The design cracks. Managing internal decay. A prolonged strategy of weakness creates internal strain. Fighters age. Resources thin. Ideological cohesion erodes. Without decisive moments, meaning becomes harder to sustain. Leadership must constantly justify why nothing appears to be happening. This creates space for splinter groups, criminalization, extremism, loss of civilian support. The strategy depends on an internal narrative as much as an external one. If the organization cannot explain patience to itself, it will not survive. The invisible balancing act. Execution requires balancing contradictions. Act enough to remain relevant. Restrain enough to avoid clarity. Absorb losses without demoralization. Avoid success that invites annihilation. There is no checklist for this. It is improvisation under pressure. Small errors accumulate. Correct decisions look like weakness. Wrong decisions look like courage. From the outside, this phase appears static. From the inside, it is constant crisis management. And all of it rests on one assumption: that the enemy will continue responding in predictable, constrained ways. The moment that assumption fails, execution collapses. Which leads to the turning point of the entire strategy. How does the stronger side actually respond, and where do they go wrong? The stronger side does not fail because it is blind. It fails because it sees through the wrong framework. At this stage of the conflict, the enemy believes they understand what is happening. They are wrong, but not in the way they think. The signals the enemy thinks it is receiving. From the perspective of a modern military command, the pattern appears familiar. The enemy avoids contact. Attacks are sporadic and localized. Territory is abandoned rather than defended. Leadership targets are difficult to identify. These are interpreted as signs of degradation. The conclusion seems logical. The enemy is under pressure. Their capacity is shrinking. Persistence will finish the job. This reading is reinforced by intelligence reporting that emphasizes capability, not intent. Fewer fighters detected. Less coordination observed. No visible massing. Doctrine translates this into progress. Why the interpretation is structurally flawed. The error is not analytical. It is conceptual. The stronger side assumes that behavior reflects weakness under stress. But in this strategy, behavior is the strategy. Avoidance is not fear. Dispersion is not collapse. Silence is not defeat. The enemy is not being pushed back. They are pulling the stronger side forward, into a longer, more expensive commitment. What appears as passivity is deliberate shaping. Overreaction as a predictable outcome. As incidents continue without resolution, pressure mounts inside the stronger side system. Commanders are asked, why has this not ended? What progress can be shown? What more can be done? This pressure rarely produces patience. It produces escalation. Force levels increase. Rules are loosened. Operations expand. Each escalation is justified as necessary to break the stalemate. But each escalation also raises civilian exposure, increases media scrutiny, expands political risk, deepens responsibility for outcomes. The stronger side is not gaining leverage. They are accumulating obligations. The misreading of restraint. Occasionally, restraint is attempted. Force is reduced. Engagements are limited. Negotiation channels are explored. These moments are meant to test whether pressure has worked. But restraint sends ambiguous signals. To domestic audiences, it looks like weakness. To allies, it looks like doubt. To the non-state actor, it looks like validation. The enemy does not interpret restraint as opportunity for peace. They interpret it as proof that endurance works. So they wait. And waiting costs them less. The command structure problem. Another critical failure emerges at the organizational level. Modern militaries operate through layered command structures designed for control. But control requires clarity. When the enemy denies clarity, command systems degrade. Lower-level commanders face unclear objectives, conflicting guidance, legal uncertainty, political sensitivity. Decision-making slows. Risk aversion increases. Initiative narrows to self-protection rather than strategic effect. Meanwhile, the non-state actors' decentralized structure absorbs chaos better. Their lack of formal hierarchy, once seen as weakness, becomes adaptive. The intelligence paradox. As the conflict drags on, intelligence improves in volume but worsens in usefulness. More data is collected. More patterns are tracked. More targets are identified. But understanding does not deepen. Because intelligence systems are optimized to answer who, where, how many. They struggle with why this action? Why now? Why not escalate? The enemy's strategy is not located in a place. It is located in the absence of a place. And that is hard to brief. The decisive misinterpretation. Eventually, the stronger side reaches a conclusion. The enemy is persistent but limited. Time is on our side. We can outlast them. This belief locks in the final error. Because in these wars, time is not neutral. Time erodes. Public patience. Alliance cohesion. Strategic clarity. Moral confidence. The stronger side begins to lose not because it is defeated, but because it cannot justify continuing. And the enemy senses this before anyone else. They do not need to strike harder. They need to remain. Remain visible enough to prevent closure. Remain weak enough to avoid annihilation. Remain ambiguous enough to deny resolution. When this balance holds, the outcome becomes inevitable. Not victory. Not defeat. Withdrawal. Which brings us to the moment history usually misreads. The ending. And the cost that remains long after the war fades from headlines. The war does not end with surrender. It ends with fatigue. Not the kind measured in casualties or equipment losses, but exhaustion embedded in institutions, politics, and public tolerance. The visible outcome. At some point, the stronger side announces a shift. A drawdown. A transition. A handover. A new phase. The language is careful. It avoids the word defeat. Operationally, forces leave. Strategically, the objective dissolves. The non-state actor does not claim victory in conventional terms. They do not need to. Survival becomes proof. Continuation becomes legitimacy. What matters is not who holds ground, but who remains when the other leaves. Why this outcome looks ambiguous, but is not. To external observers, the result feels unsatisfying. No decisive battle. No signed document. No moment of closure. This ambiguity is often framed as complexity. It is not. It is the intended result of the strategy. By denying the stronger side a clean ending, the weaker side ensures that the war cannot be narrated as success. The cost cannot be justified retroactively. The sacrifices cannot be neatly explained. Ambiguity is not failure of history. It is the final weapon. The human cost. This strategy extracts its price slowly. Civilians live under prolonged uncertainty. Violence becomes intermittent but persistent. Normal life never fully returns. Unlike conventional wars, there is no post-war recovery phase. There is only adjustment. For fighters, the cost is different. Years of waiting replace moments of action. Trauma accumulates without resolution. Identity becomes bound to conflict that never formally ends. For the stronger side's soldiers, repeated deployments without strategic clarity. Missions framed as progress, then quietly abandoned. A growing sense that sacrifice lacks purpose. This erosion is invisible in casualty statistics, but it shapes memory. The logistical cost. For the stronger side, logistics bleed over time. Not through catastrophic loss, but through sustained inefficiency. Every year requires renewed funding, extended contracts, rebuilt political consensus. Costs accumulate without delivering proportional gain. The weaker side pays less per year, but pays indefinitely. Their logistics remain fragile, opportunistic, and exhausting. The strategy survives only as long as the logistical trickle continues. Cut it completely, and collapse follows. The political cost. Politically, the stronger side loses coherence. Leaders inherit wars they did not start. Opposition exploits ambiguity. Allies grow cautious. Every decision becomes defensive. Why stay? Why leave? Why now? No answer satisfies all audiences. Eventually, withdrawal becomes the least damaging option. Not because it solves the problem, but because continuing creates more problems than it prevents. The weaker side pays a different political price. Success without resolution often leads to internal power struggles, radicalization, fragmentation. The strategy that ensured survival does not guarantee governance. The psychological cost for decision makers. For those who designed and sustained the strategy, the burden is heavy. They carry the knowledge that ending the conflict early might have meant annihilation. Prolonging it guaranteed suffering. There is no clean moral ledger. On the stronger side, commanders and policymakers face a different reckoning. They are not remembered as defeated generals. They are remembered as managers of unresolved wars. That distinction haunts institutions. If the strategy had failed, failure would not have come through battlefield defeat. It would have come through miscalculation. If the stronger side had accepted ambiguity, reduced political exposure, shifted metrics away from visibility, chosen containment over resolution, the strategy of weaponized weakness would have lost leverage. The war would not have ended decisively, but it would have stopped generating pressure. In that scenario, the weaker side would face a slow suffocation. No collapse. No triumph. Just irrelevance. The uncomfortable truth. This strategy does not promise justice. It does not promise peace. It does not promise stability. It promises survival at a cost. And when it works, it leaves behind a question history rarely asks honestly. Was this outcome better than defeat? Or merely less visible? That question leads us to the final task. To step back. To extract what this strategy actually teaches. And what it dangerously encourages others to believe. If this strategy teaches anything, it is not a tactic. It is a warning. Weaponized weakness is not a clever workaround for inferior firepower. It is a structural exploitation of how modern power is organized, justified, and constrained. What this strategy is really about. At its core, this is not a military strategy. It is a systems strategy. It targets decision-making architectures, political accountability chains, public tolerance for ambiguity, institutional need for measurable success. The battlefield is incidental. The real arena is governance under pressure. The weaker side does not try to overpower the enemy. They try to outlast the enemy's ability to explain itself. That is the inversion. The rule it breaks, and why that matters. Classical strategy assumes power seeks decisive outcomes. Weakness seeks avoidance. Victory ends conflict. This strategy rejects all three. It assumes power is brittle when constrained. Weakness is adaptive when organized. Conflict can be sustained as leverage. This is why the strategy feels unsettling. It does not aim to win in the traditional sense. It aims to make winning irrelevant. And that is deeply dangerous. Because once victory is no longer required, there is no natural stopping point. Why this strategy cannot be copied blindly. This is where popular narratives go wrong. They treat weaponized weakness as a formula. Avoid battles. Prolong war. Exploit politics. That interpretation is shallow and fatal. This strategy works only under very specific conditions. The enemy must be politically accountable. Their use of force must be legally constrained. Their legitimacy must matter to themselves. Their public must demand closure. Remove any one of these, and the logic collapses. Against an enemy willing to contain indefinitely, accept ambiguity, externalize costs, reduce visibility, weakness becomes exposure. The hidden dependency no one admits. This strategy depends on the enemy remaining strong but restrained. It does not work against total war systems, actors indifferent to legitimacy, enemies willing to disengage emotionally and politically. In other words, it feeds on the very norms that make modern states function. That creates a moral paradox. The strategy succeeds precisely because the enemy follows rules, and it incentivizes abandoning those rules. This is the long-term risk. The lesson for strong actors. The failure here is not military incompetence. It is strategic misalignment. Strong actors lose not because they lack power, but because they apply power to the wrong problem. The lesson is not use more force or use less force. It is this: if you cannot define what ending looks like, do not escalate. If your success metrics do not align with your political system, they will be used against you. And if ambiguity benefits the enemy more than you, time is not your ally. The lesson for weak actors. For non-state forces, the lesson is harsher. Weaponized weakness is not a path to liberation. It is a path to survival under permanent stress. It demands extreme discipline, internal coherence, moral compromise, acceptance of prolonged suffering. Most groups cannot sustain it. Those that try often collapse from within, long before the enemy adapts. The final contradiction. This strategy is often described as smart. That misses the point. It is rational, not wise. It optimizes survival, not resolution. It exploits systems, not builds alternatives. It wins time, not futures. And when it spreads, it reshapes conflict itself. Wars without endings. Victories without peace. Withdrawal without closure. That is the legacy. Not because the weak learned to fight better, but because the strong never learned what kind of war they were actually in. History often asks who won. That is the wrong question. The more honest one is this: what kind of conflicts do we create when weakness becomes a strategy and strength becomes a liability? Because once that inversion takes hold, wars no longer end when someone is defeated. They end when someone gives up explaining why they are still fighting. And that is not a military failure. It is a systemic one.